I guess we started coming to Maine in 1636. They came over to Salem in 1632, and then were driven out, and then came back, and Great Mosher Island, a little Mosher Island out near Yarmouth, were named for our family, and I guess they probably spent the winters out there to protect themselves from the Indians. And then they were in the Portland area. I think where the University of Southern Maine was the Deering Estate, and they had that for a while, and a couple hundred acres there and along Back Bay, and then moved out here in the 1750s, and they were the third family here in town. And, I guess as far as me personally concerned, I think my great-grandfather supplied the wood to S.D. Warren to heat the mill back when they first started up, and then the next generation, my grandmother's brother was head of the finishing department at S.D. Warren, and then my father's cousin was assistant superintendent in the finishing department, and then I worked in research and production and engineering and corporate engineering. They used rags, and one of the things that S.D. Warren did was he traveled abroad and bought rags, and they were apparently in short supply, and so they would post ads and encourage people to save scraps of cloth so that they could be put into these stamping machines and crushed and so forth, and then made into paper, and so they realized that the supply of those was limited, and that there was a saying that in the book here that at sometimes they made more money selling rags than they did by making paper. So, but then in 1880 they decided to go to a different source, and so they went to wood pulp, and they were using a soda process, which was not it was not very strong as far as the paper was concerned, and the cooking process weakened it. So they did that until I think around 1929, when they went to the sulfite process, and we had that mill, and that was kind of scrapped, I guess. I guess it wasn't very effective, because when we went there in 1950, whatever, 59, why they were, I think they were still using the soda process, and then Bob Heisey came, and that was what, in the 1957, 58, 59.
I think so, yes.
And he was instrumental in switching over to sulfate. And
sulfate, which is the craft process, which is the one that smells.
Yeah.
He created that mercaptan odor.
Right. And that's extremely. There used to be bottles of that, reference bottles in the laboratory next to my office, and they were in bottles with wax sealant on the top, and within 15 minutes of when they shut that fan off, the odor would drift into my office. So it's parts per billion that the nose can detect.
Chemically, it's very similar to skunk odor.
Yeah.
Very, very, very permeating.
So at that time they went to sulfate, but.
Well, now what was the connection with Sudemeister? Sudemeister worked for S.D. Warren?
Sudemeister was called the father of paper chemistry at one point, and he came up with
coating paper, really?
Well, the one that I remember was putting alkaline fillers in paper, and before that it had been acid and rosin and alum, and if you're familiar with newspapers and how they degrade, that's an example. But Sudemeister discovered that if you put calcium carbonate as a filler in paper, then it would maintain its brightness for a longer period of time and its strength. So I think that was one of the contributions that I remember him for, and so for many years, about the time Charlie and I were there, Warren papers were the only papers that were
Yeah, that's right.
accepted by the Library of Congress for longevity, and then gradually I was a little surprised, and the research director from Glatfelder came up, and we openly shared what we were doing with them and so forth, and they were one of our main competitors.
Yeah.
So in order to support the large research group that we had, we ended up licensing companies in Italy and Norway, the Netherlands, England, Japan, and so we would share with them our information on coding that we had developed up through World War II, and at that time the Europeans were pretty much concentrated on making plain paper and doing it very well, and so if looking through some of the British technical proceedings back in that time, that's the conclusion that I came to. So that's why one of the reasons why they were over here trying to learn from us and to get a head start on doing that. So we had a very close relationship with those people. Also somebody from Germany that we had an affiliation with. So that money helped support some of our research. My initial career, I guess, started off in 1956, and that was, I started off in the pulping area, and we were doing some of the evaluation on the stronger sulfate pulps and different cooking procedures, and so I spent 8 months working in that group and just kind of got my feet on the ground, and then went over to a coating group, which was a cast coating group, which is a very, very shiny paper that you see in these Take Me Home, shipping or packaging materials and so forth. So we worked pretty hard trying to be the best at that, and then a couple of years later I started working in the semi-works and ran that for a while, and then took over the printing paper coating research and did that from 1962 to 1969. And about that time, one of the processes that we developed went into the mill, and we ended up tearing out a paper machine and some other equipment and putting in it was a 134-inch wide coater that would run 3,000 feet a minute. So it eventually put out half the mill production in the Westbrook mill.
How many paper machines were there in there when you started?
Well, I think there were 13.
13, yeah. Were they all running?
Number 13, yeah. Yes, they were.
Yeah.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 were downstairs, 9 was upstairs, 10 was up, 10, 14.
9's the only one that's running right now, isn't it?
That's correct. Yeah. And so then we gradually shut those down, and at that time the mill production was maybe 500 and some odd tons a day, and we eventually shut down a number of machines and increased the production to about 750 tons a day at the Westbrook Mill. So in 1969, when this prototype machine started up, I went down to act as an advisor during the installation of it, and ended up staying there and running it for the next 10 years. And
that's 70 coater?
That was 70 coater. Yeah. And it was successful, and for a long time it was probably had the highest order uptime of any of the major machines there in the mill. And then in 1976 we put that technology on a paper machine in Mobile, Alabama, at the Scott plant down there, and then in 1983 Muskegon, Michigan, and also Skowhegan. We put the first machine up there in Skowhegan, and then I worked from 1980, say, to 1982 as paper mill engineer, supervising project engineer at Westbrook, and then in the beginning of 1983, when the Somerset Mill went in, I went up and was kind of a troubleshooter up there, and wherever there was I was mainly in charge of the calendars and the new process that we put in, and whenever we had a problem with that, why I would find ways to get around whatever the issue was, and then in 1983 in the fall, we ended up starting up the same process at Skowhegan, Michigan. So, and I was never bored. I guess we always had problems. It was just a question of what they were. And I guess my dad told me at one point that his grandfather had supplied all of the wood that was used for heating at the mill. This was probably back in the late 1800s. So that was that generation. That was 4 generations back. 3 generations back, my grandmother's brother was head of the finishing department, and then 2 generations back, my dad's cousin was assistant superintendent in the paper machine department. And then I worked there in 1954 while I was going to University of Maine at Orono, and then I graduated and went to work for Ingersoll Rand in Pennsylvania, and then after that I was in the service for my ROTC commitment, and then when we were getting ready to go back to Pennsylvania, my wife's mother had lost her husband, and so she had 3 younger children, and Kay felt that she would feel more comfortable back here so that she could help her mom with those kids, and so she ended up suggesting that we came back. So I came up and talked with Fred Frost and asked him about a job, and he offered me a job, and I went back to Maryland thinking about it, and then called back and said that I'd be interested, and he sent a letter back, which was classic Fred. He said, "Splendid," with an exclamation point, signed Fred. And that was Fred Frost.
Yeah, right.
I came back, and as I said earlier, I worked in the pulping section there with Ty Werner, and this was basically to give me a little understanding of paper, and then went to the Lusticoat group and spent some time there. And about that time, this house came on the market, and so we were fortunate to get this.
This was not a family house?
No, it was 1959. It was we bought it from 2 people. One of them, his middle name was Mosher, and the other one was a niece, and her father's middle name was Mosher. So there was a Mosher involved with their parents and so forth. But then I went back and looked at the Cloudman property, and back in around 1758, this property was owned by Cloudmans, and that's a whole other interesting story. He was kidnapped and taken to Canada, and then his watch was found on a corpse that was found on Lake Champlain the following spring. So he tried to get away and didn't make it. So, came back here and worked in research, and then semi-works. Then I took over the printing paper group research, and so that was interesting. Went into the mill, worked there, and then gradually went through troubleshooting. After I retired, I ended up consulting from 1997 until 2008.
I thought you did, yeah.
And that was, I could be at any of our mills, I guess, and also Western Europe. Looking back, I was probably fortunate to start in research and then go to production, and then into engineering, and eventually troubleshooting and consulting, and got so at the end it was, I'd walk in on a problem and I might or might not know much about it, but it didn't take very long before I got people involved that did know something about it, and so we were reasonably successful doing those things.
S.D. Warren was really one of the paper companies most focused on research, wasn't it? Really?
I think so. And when I started in research, I was R58 in 1954. I was number 58, and so we're down to about that number now. But at one time, in the 1990s, we were up to 210
in the research lab.
In the research lab, and but then licensing.
Well, that's some very sophisticated equipment in there too, spectrometers and all those things.
Yes, we did. Yeah, electron microscopes, and in fact, we really didn't understand very much about what paper coatings looked like, and about materials, and after we got some of that equipment around, where we developed our understanding in considerable depth. Initially, I think they started off with, well, in the paper industry in the United States, it was kind of a brown, unbleached sheet, and then gradually they ended up bleaching paper, and so that it was whiter. And then in the late 1800s, I think we were pretty much driven by salespeople, so they were concerned about the appearance of paper, and not just the manufacturing of tons out the door. In those days, it was sheets of paper, really out, sheets of paper a year that they were counting. So, being a sales-driven company, we were concerned about, as Bob McAvoy, one of our presidents, said, having delighted customers, and one of those things was having paper that didn't cause problems when it was being printed, and also delivered excellent results. And for many years, they had a display in the Boston office of examples of people's work that was outstanding, and so you could walk in there and just be wowed by all these excellent printing jobs that had been done all over the country. So we got into coating, and then dull coating came in. One of I think the fellow's name was Smith, and he didn't like the glossy paper, so then he developed a dull coating, and basically at those times it was paper was coated in Caledon, and then had the second coat that Charlie mentioned earlier, which would kind of dull the sheet down, and then later on it became an embossing of the surface to make it dull, just to roughen up the surface. And one of the things that would bother me with reading very glossy paper was that you'd get a shine from lights, and this would be distracting as you were reading it. So we had a good market with dull grades that were coated for a long time. So we had the glossy coateds for packaging, and then the dull coateds, and then we got into making embossed papers for various effects. For you might want to have a printing piece that was impressive, so you do that, and then eventually that went over into the specialty grades, and what Charlie worked on, which was using an embossed release grade to develop a pattern in the urethane and vinyl surfaces, and those were used for headliners and clothing.
Shoes, handbags,
yeah.
Things like that.
We made covers for annual reports, as Charlie says. We made Sears catalog cover. And one of the interesting stories there was the salesman, Bob Hilarities, from Chicago. He was talking with me and saying that Consolidated was going to be making some of their paper for them, and I was really surprised. I thought, being the sales manager in that area, why he would want all the business, and I couldn't understand why he didn't. And about 6 months later, we went on strike, and the last order that we made was the Sears catalog cover, and so his wisdom was borne out, that if you have an alternate supplier, then you're not placed in an awkward situation of not being able to produce paper when the conditions were beyond your control. I guess one of the things As Charlie and I both know, we were working with a really great bunch of people, and I think we worked looking back on it, we worked as a team pretty well, and so we had people who had strong points in certain areas. I guess I got involved with coding, and then ended up making some contributions in the coding area. The price of casein went from 18 cents to 70 cents a pound, and at that time we were the largest purchaser of casein in the world, and I think it was around 1,800 tons a year we were using. Came from Australia and New Zealand and Brazil. I guess I worked with a company worked with Dow Chemical in order to go to more synthetic binders. And after World War II, there was a GRS, which government rubber survey, and they worked during World War II to come up with butadiene styrene compounds for tires, because the trade routes to the Far East had been cut off, and so they came up with this product. And then after World War II, they were trying to figure out where they could use this excess capacity. And John Stinchfield and Dow Chemical had some of the basic patents in styrene butadiene lattices, which were used as binders or adhesives in the coating. And so I ended up pushing up the use of that to at least double and maybe triple what we were formerly using. That was one of the first things that I did. And then when I was in SemiWorks, I was interested in combining coating and calendaring, and so we kept that on the back burner, and eventually three of us had a patent on that, and that's basically what the Skowhegan Mill was founded on. And so when I went up there, that was the area that I was assigned to for troubleshooting, and we got into some pretty interesting times when I was at Westbrook, starting up that prototype coater. I got about half my gray hair between 37 and 40. Just some of the time I'd be in there 28 hours in a row and trying to wade through some of the problems. And when we had problems, there was nowhere we could turn, because we were the only people doing it. And so we had to solve them, and the significance was considerable. One of the times I was at a coating conference, and someone from Crown Zellerbeck in Camas, Washington came up to me and he said, "You guys really bet the farm on the Skowhegan Mill," and I guess I had known it but hadn't really thought about it very much. But he was right. If this process that we were using at Westbrook and hadn't worked out, we had no alternative up there. We had not put in super calendars, and that's the way paper had always been finished in the past. And so I don't think we ever shut the mill down, but we could have very easily. Some of the other rolls that were being supplied by one of the resilient roll manufacturers, we had problems with them, and we lost 18 of them in a row. And these rolls were, well, they'd weigh 38,000 pounds and cost between $40,000 and $50,000 a piece. So, and then we broke some other rolls that were pretty expensive too. They were around $400,000 a piece. But,
steel roll.
yeah. And when those broke, we had a group of about 14 people, and we just got the best help that we could get in the United States and Western Europe, and we spent a couple of years working on it, and so those were, I think, one of the things that impressed me. We had a company called D&G in Westbrook, and Chuck Talling used to help us out in supplying, fixing broken parts and so forth. He never knew the word the meaning of the word no, and I think that was one of the things with our group. Once we get into a problem, regardless of how serious it was, we just sat down around the table and said, how are we going to fix this? And we'd develop a bunch of ideas, and then we'd work on the low-hanging fruit first, and then work through and solve the problems. But at times we were really at risk, and with the great group of people that we had, we were able to pull it off, and I was part of that. And one of the things that at Skowhegan, the machines were so big that we could afford to put in instrumentation, so that we made it right the first time. And at Westbrook, I remember struggling to not have more than 3 splices per roll in rolled paper that went out to these printers. And at Skowhegan, with 3 times the production that we had out of the Westbrook mill, it was unusual to see 3 splices in a month up there. So we just made it right, and we had the lowest complaints and the highest tons per complaint of anybody in the industry up there, primarily because we were just so fussy, and we put in equipment to do things right the first time, and we could measure online. If the paper was within quality, we knew it. If it was out of quality, we fixed it. So that was
What happened to the industry now that that you're not selling sheets? I mean, the printers, of course, has that died up?
We still have a sheeting plant in Allentown.
Really?
And we moved the sheeting out of Westbrook and put in a sheeting operation down there. So we do ship the rolls
from Somerset to Allentown.
From Somerset to Allentown, and sheet them. And then if you've got somebody like us has a small printing plant where they can buy from out of there.
Yeah. Okay.
But primarily the big companies. There's Quebecor was not a customer of ours, but they were out in Memphis, and they would take 110-inch wide rolls from Madison and make the Sunday supplement for Sears, and they were printing like 7 million supplements a week or something like that. Beautiful plant. So they were converting over to rolls, but basically, I think the industry's been driven by price, and so we just continually drive the price down, and the companies and the processes that can survive do, and the ones that don't go by the wayside. I think Skowhegan is converting into packaging. We still are pretty strong in packaging. If I look at the recycling that we do each week, I'm surprised at how much paper that Kay and I develop. So I think packaging will remain strong. I think there'll always be some book sales. Fortunately or unfortunately, there's a lot of direct mail that goes on, and we continue to get several mailers a day. How valuable that is, that's probably declining with the internet, where you can research products. Probably specialty things like air filters, and those may continue for a while. Certainly newsprint, I guess that's declining. We were at one of the Weyerhaeuser companies back in 1993, and they'd taken a license for our process, and so they were going over the future of newsprint, and basically the line was down, and that was when Great Northern was still operating, and so they've shut down, and so I think newsprint probably will go down. There'll be other uses that we don't envision will come along, maybe niche businesses, and then the release papers, which are the vinyl casting papers and urethane casting papers. Those are kind of, I won't say niche, but they're probably more than niche. One of the things that bothers me, I guess, is I would go to Germany and sit down with the heads of companies there, and they once a month they would go to a university and discuss ways that Germany could compete in the world marketplace. And at the same time over here, we were getting hit with, we were not able to talk with our competitors, or we were at the risk of antitrust violations, and so consequently I think we were at a disadvantage to them. And so I think collaboration with the government and is fine, and with other paper companies, but I think you can learn from each other and cut costs and be more efficient in the world stage with that kind of behavior. I think in the biochemical industry, why there will be opportunities, and maybe there are now, where you can use the wood products that we have and then process them into something so that either they're used as either fuels or pharmaceuticals or other products that can be used. And I think that's what we're going to be seeing in the next 30 years or so. There'll be just an unbelievable expansion in that area. I guess all in all, I feel very fortunate that in the decisions that we made, and some of the time when in my lifetime I would have a condition arise and so forth, and it seemed like a disappointment at the time, and somehow or other it worked out, and we've just been fabulously lucky with the wife that I chose, and the wife that chose me, I guess, and we were able to raise our children in a nice area. They've been able to go other places and contribute, and it's a little bit disappointing to me that we don't have more opportunity for them here in the state, because out of the 4 children, only one of them lives here, and 2 of them probably would live here if they could, if there were the opportunities that either there once were or there could be. But there aren't many things that I would do differently if I were to do them over again. So the main thing is take advantage of opportunity and do the best you can with it.
We were lucky enough to work a long time for a very good company.
Yeah, that is true, and I think one of the reasons we put in #1 machine at Skowhegan, we had a tax write-off that we were up against that deadline, and so we were able to put that in, and it's created hundreds of millions of dollars of activity in the state.
How many machines they got running?
They've got 3 up there.
Got 3 now.
And they'll run up to 2,800 tons a day.
Yeah,
so just amazing, and the suppliers that we have and the people that we have good jobs and really good people. I think for the most part, maybe 1% or something like that had their own issues that they were dealing with. But one of the things, Warren apparently was interested in innovation, or innovative as we went along, and the water system down here, they ran short of water, or good water, so they put a well in, and they used to pump that through a log pipe to the mill. It was a mile or so, and then that was 30 years later.
A long time ago.
Yeah, that was in the 1850s, and then that was discontinued in the 1880s, and they went to a regular pipe. But then when they ran short of water there, they ended up developing a sand filter, and so they would use screens to take the brush out and then run it through these piles of sand, and it was popular enough so that the city of Philadelphia adopted it as a water filtration process down there. The other thing that was kind of unique with Westbrook was the power, and they would get their power they owned half the power plant, and then they ended up buying the other half of the water power, and I think they talked about a 20-foot drop at Westbrook, but they would put in these generating stations at other dams. And interestingly enough, Westbrook was the first one to put in a high tension or high voltage AC transmission line, and this was Stone and Webster's first job. And Stone was the one that worked on it. So they're the first AC in New England. And so that being innovative, they did that. And in part of the old mill down there was a Stanley engine, and this Stanley engine was an electric motor, and it received power from a smelt hill, and so that drove that. Then there was a line shaft, and there was a water turbine, and it had a rope drive, and I think it had 13 shifts on it, and this inch or inch and a half rope was the belt that ran around it, and it ran progressively from one V to the next, and then ran through a crossover pulley that took it back to the start again. So then this line shaft not only had the electric power from hydro generation, but it had water power, and then they hooked a big Macintosh steam engine to the end of it, and that was a 400 horsepower, I think, double expansion steam engine. Had a flywheel that was probably approaching 20 feet in diameter, and so they could drive the beaters from this line shaft, which was really pretty. They had 3 different sources of power from it, and one of the fellows, I think his name was Bill Henkel, but he would if they wanted to bring the steam engine on power, he'd take his steel, 6-inch steel scale, and he'd put it on one side of the coupling, and it would go clickety clickety click, and he'd put it on the other side of the coupling, and it would go clickety clickety click. And when he judged that they were right, he'd slam the 2 of them together, and most of the time he did pretty well with it. From what I heard, I never saw him do it, but so that was part of the innovation. And then they eventually expanded up and raised the height of Sebago by 5 feet, and then again they made another addition to it. This was back in the late 1800s, so that they would have a more continuous use of water going into the mill, and there were the people at the upper end of Westbrook, called Sakarappa, controlled the power dams there, and they would run them during the daytime. There were sawmills and so forth, and they'd shut them down at night. And of course, the paper mill wanted to run for 24 hours, so then they got together with Mr. Dana and Mr. Warren, and I think Dana was then selling power to Westbrook. It was Westbrook Power and Light, and so they sold electricity to the city, so they would leave the hydro station on at night, generating power for the town, and then Warren benefited by having continuous water flow. So those were some of the earlier innovations that you don't even think about when you think about paper mills, or S.D. Warren.